Okay, so when we looked at exponential growth, we saw this population that just shot up and just kept going at this incredibly steep rate. Well, now what we're looking, and we said that doesn't usually happen in nature. And we said that with exponential growth, we kind of assume that no matter how big the population gets, whatever that organism is keeps having just as many babies as they did, maybe more. They don't start dying off in greater numbers. So none of the rates change, which means the bigger the population gets, the faster it gets bigger. You have more individuals who are ready to have babies. This is a little closer to reality, but it's still a model. It is still a model, and that's an important word to keep in mind. So in the logistic growth model, we look at a population that grows for a while and then levels off. And we call that point at which it levels off the carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is, what do you think of when you hear the words carrying capacity? What is capacity, first of all?
How much of something you can fit in?
Yeah, how much something you can fit in, how much something you can manage. We talk about your capacity for academic performance, how well you can do. So carrying capacity is literally how many the environment can support. Oh, hey, it's right there. I forgot. Carrying capacity is literally the number of individuals that the environment can support over a long period of time. What this assumes is that as you get up to this point, up to here, birth and death rates haven't been changing. When you get to here, it assumes that either birth rates drop or death rates increase or a little bit of both, and suddenly the population is no longer growing, but those birth and death rates are pretty much equal. Because remember, if you've got flatline population growth, birth rate equals death rate, and you have a population growth of 0. There was a big move in the 70s called ZPG. Can you guess what that stood for? Zero population growth. And it was sort of an environmental movement, and it was encouraging, and this was specifically in the U.S. I don't know if it was a big deal in other parts of the country, but it was specifically encouraging families, look, have 2 kids, no more. 2 kids is replacement. Well, China's a whole different matter. They actually had a policy that forced negative population growth for many, many years, the one-child policy, and they've only recently lifted the one-child policy.
Yeah, bad idea.
Oh, on many levels. But ZPG was just aimed to make people think more carefully about the fact that human population is growing. It's growing rapidly, and at some point you run out of resources. There's a finite number of individuals that any environment can support. So that was zero population growth, and that just means that births equal deaths. Okay, so this carrying capacity is something that how do you tell when a population's at carrying capacity? Well, if you see a population graph that looks something like that. So this is time, this is number of individuals. And let's say we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. Maybe this is a small population of, I don't know, bass in a lake. You could imagine. So if this was bass, we'll make them smallmouth, in a pond. So we're talking about a population because we've named the species, we've named the location. This is, in, we'll say this is, tell you what, Smith's Pond. We'll give you a pond, Noah. Okay. This is the population of smallmouth bass in Smith's Pond. Maybe you just dug this pond. Maybe like the pond out here, it's a new pond. You start off with 0 population. You like to fish? You like some smallmouth for dinner? Tasty and delicious. So you stock the pond. Who here has ever participated in stocking a pond? Has anybody ever been part of that process? Okay. When I worked for Soil and Water, we used to have a twice-a-year fish sale. And Fender's Fish Hatchery from somewhere down around Coshocton would come in with their big, it looks like a tanker truck with multiple chambers, with little lid lifters. And Mr. Fender would climb up on the tanker, and he was ancient and really agile. He climbed like a little mountain goat, and he was this little old white-haired man with his net, and he'd pull your order out of the tanks, put them in boxes. You know, there was a whole protocol for doing it. So you start off with a pond with 0 population. You put some smallmouth in there, and typically when you stock a pond, you would also put some food species in if you're putting in a predator species like a smallmouth. So I think they recommended something like for every smallmouth you bought, you should buy 100 minnows or something. And they also sold minnows. There was some rate. So you throw those smallmouth in to the pond. You throw a bunch of food in with them. What's going to happen?
They're gonna eat the food.
They're going to eat the food. They're going to make more smallmouth. They're going to make babies. You know, everything reproduces in kind if it's a living thing. So that population is going to climb until we get to a certain point, and it's going to start to level off. So there's a limited amount. What do minnows eat? Algae, bugs, depending on the minnow species. Some of them are little plant eaters. So there's a limit to how many minnows you can have. That's the food source for the smallmouth. There's going to come a point when the smallmouth population growth is going to taper off. So if you're looking at a graph like this, and let's even make it a little bit more extreme. So let's say it looks like that. It's got some peaks and valleys. Maybe they have a really good year. Maybe there's some nutrients in the pond and there's some algae and the minnows do well. Maybe you throw in more minnows. You know, they have a bit of a population spike, and then you have a rough winter and you have a die-off. So if you look at a population graph like this, what could you say the carrying capacity is? The carrying capacity is where you're looking at a graph and you're seeing where does that population level. So what would be would 20 be a reasonable estimate? No. Would 70 be a reasonable estimate? No. Give me a reasonable estimate. There's not just one right answer here. 50, 55. Okay, so here's the best way to do this. If we draw a line through sort of the average of that graph, does that pretty much hit about the same? Actually, maybe that should be a little bit lower, huh? Does that hit about the same amount of space above the graph and under the graph? Some high points above and below, for the most part, running around average. So maybe somewhere in the low 50s is a sustainable population. So this line is your carrying capacity. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, there is a question on the AIR practice test that's very much like this. So they reference, I don't know what it is, a species of wildebeest, some species of some organism. And they talk about the population has grown, and then there's a disease outbreak, and they give you a population graph very much like this, and they ask you, what's the carrying capacity? So when you're using a chart or a graph like this, and you're trying to find carrying capacity, you're looking for that sort of average around where the population is fluctuating. Remember what fluctuate means?
Changes.
Yeah, to change, to go up and down. And if we look at this population, is it fluctuating? Yeah. There are better years, there are worse years, but it's all kind of hovering around an average mark, and that's your carrying capacity. Okay, so in the logistic growth model, limiting factors are what limit the carrying capacity. There are some assumptions with this model. We assume that carrying capacity doesn't really change, and that may or may not be true. This is something we do commonly see. We actually see a pretty good representation of this model. We started to kind of, whoa, the corner wasn't where I thought it was, to kind of talk about what can limit growth when we talked about the rats. So we said, what during the time when all the bamboo fruit was on the ground, what was limiting their growth? Nothing. After the bamboo fruit was gone, after all the rice was gone, either harvested by rats or harvested by humans, then what was limiting their growth? Yeah, the amount of food they could get. Literally, the amount of food that was available to them limited their growth. And a limit to growth can play out in two ways. Number one, a limit to growth can take your death rate and make it shoot up. In the case of the rats after Maotam, when all the bamboo fruit was gone, when all the rice was gone, this is what you saw. You had massive starvation. The other thing that a limiting factor can do is take your birth rate and drop your birth rate somehow. So you can have limiting factors that limit the availability of, basically the ability to reproduce. That could be something like nesting sites. If you are a species that will not, for instance, come into heat or mate until there's a nesting site, then if there's not a nesting site, your birth rate goes down. It limits your birth rate.
Excuse the interruption.
So if we talk about fish again, we go back to Noah's Pond, and we look at bass. How do bass reproduce? So first, sexually or asexually?
Sexually.
Sexually. Not with a sex act, but the male comes along, he makes a nest in like loose rocks along the edge of the pond, and the female comes along, picks out the nest that she thinks is nicest, deposits her eggs there, he swims over it, squirts his sperm on top of them, and it's done. Well, what if you have a pond that doesn't have any good nesting sites for bass? It's got no habitat. Would that limit your birth rate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was an article in the journal the other day, and you've probably seen this. Christmas trees swim with the fishes at Berlin. You see that? Okay. Have you heard of this? Take a bunch of old Christmas trees and you throw them in a lake.
Yeah, it gives them shade and shelter.
It provides shelter. Who needs that shelter?
Little fish.
Little fish. Yeah, because little fish are pretty defenseless. When you're this big, everybody would like to eat you. So, we think of like bass or pike or muskies as predators, but when they're this big, they're also prey. They're really vulnerable. When I worked for the Division of Wildlife, they did a project with the state parks where old picnic tables that were like half rotten, they would take old picnic tables and they would haul them out into the lake and weight them down with cement blocks. And they'd build these like almost artificial reefs out of old picnic tables. If you have no shelter in a lake for young fish, does that change your death rate or your birth rate?
Death rate.
Death rate, yeah. More young fish are going to get picked off because there's no place for them to hide. Those are factors where the habitat is one of your limiting factors. The amount of cover that's available for young fish is limiting how many young fish survive.
Don't they usually reproduce more in the warmer weather?
Most species of fish, and we could look it up. We're not going to right now, but
I noticed there's more minnows in our lake during the warmer years than there is.
various species have different temperatures which they prefer in which to reproduce. Yeah, and like again, when I worked for the division, and I was specifically, my first job was on walleye, squeezing walleye for eggs and sperm. And when I was hired, I was told, you will start when the walleye run starts. Well, when will that be? I mean, I was just out of college, I was between jobs, I was really needing that first paycheck. When's that going to be? Well, we don't know. They were monitoring water temperature. And the Division of Wildlife Biologists, and basically when the water temperature hit a certain mark, they knew that the walleye run would start. And they said, oh, it'll be between, March 15th and April 15th. Great. A little bit of uncertainty. And yeah, and minnows are a bunch of different species. There are a bunch of different species that comprise minnows. And each of those species probably has a preferred water temperature in which they will breed and reproduce. And it's almost like a biological cue for them, like, oh, the water's right. There's something I should be doing. If you ever get a chance, how many of you have been to Camp Frederick? It's it's like between Rogers and Negley on off 154. It's a Lutheran church camp. When I was in college, we did stream surveys there for entomology. And I had the most awesome, entomology is bugs. I took a lot of bug classes in college. And the guy who taught entomology, Dr. David McLean, had been teaching for 30 plus years. And he loved bugs so much, when we found something cool in the field, he would still go, oh, 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 look. He was great. He was awesome. He loved bugs. He was passionate about insects. And we did aquatic insects. And if you've ever gone fishing, and many of you fish, you know that a lot of baits look like bugs because a lot of fish are insect eaters. And I had never seen a sculpin. Do you know what a sculpin is? You know who here has ever gone, we used to call it creek stomping, just walking up the creek all day, picking up rocks, seeing what you find. It's a wonderful way to spend a summer day. It's one of the best ways to spend a summer day. So we're, of course, collecting insects under rocks with nets. And you take a flat net and you put it down under a rock and you roll the rock and you disturb all the stuff underneath the rock. And everything that's under the rock gets pushed into your net. And then you take your net, you take a big white enamel pan, looks like it came out of somebody's kitchen, you dump your stuff in it and you sort through it. And you find all the insects and you classify them and you categorize them. And I had my pan and I'm sitting on a rock in the middle of the creek, sorting through my bugs. And something really large moved in the pan, like this. Which, I mean, when everything you're looking at is this big, something this big really stands out. And there was enough mud and dirt and rocks in my pan, because you get a lot of that stuff in your net too, I couldn't see what was moving. So I keep poking, and every now and then, something would like erupt in the pan. And there'd be this like flurry of activity, and then I couldn't see it again. What is it? What is it? There's something. And it's big. I've got a pan that's a little bit bigger than this iPad, and there's something significant in it, and I can't pin it down. I can't get it. What the heck is it? This is a mottled, like spotted, sculpin. Do you see why it wouldn't really be real visible in a pan full of rocks? They are nearly invisible. They are so well camouflaged. You could pretty much step right over them in a stream bottom. You would never see them. They hide out in the rocks. They're a predator on little insects and stuff. And they're, a big sculpin would probably be 5 inches long. They're a small fish. They exist only in streams that meet the following conditions. They have to have a good gravelly bottom. You see all this stuff? And this is probably a picture out of an aquarium. But without a good gravelly bottom, they disappear. Partly because their food sources live in that gravel, and if you've got a mud bottom, they can't survive. They also have to have a relatively cold stream. So you said like your minnows like it warm. There are species that like it warm. Sculpins like it cold and oxygenated. They like lots of oxygen in their water. These fins, these pectoral fins, we think of fish's pectoral fins as being sort of up and down like this. Theirs are turned almost at a 90-degree angle because, they're like the Arnold Schwarzeneggers of the fish world. They grip the bottom of streams in super fast moving water. Who here has ever been in fast moving water? Okay, getting pushed around a little bit. You can get pushed right over. You think like, I got this. I got this. You stand up and you go, boom. Yeah, it's really pushy. These guys live in the fastest moving parts of these kinds of streams. So basically the white water, the little riffles in the stream, that's where they live. They grip the bottom. They need that high oxygen, cold water, fast moving water, gravelly bottom. So what happens to mottled sculpins in a stream where the bottom gets muddy and the water gets warm? They die. So the limiting factors here would be habitat. And this would actually probably operate on two things. So we said you can have the birth rate go down or the death rate go up. If a stream that sculpins were in changed like that, probably both would happen. More sculpin would starve, because in that muddy bottom you're not going to have the same kinds of insects. If the water gets too warm, they're probably not going to reproduce the way they used to. And warm water also can't hold as much oxygen, so they're probably going to die for lack of oxygen. Those kind of changing conditions limit the number of individuals that the environment can support. And if you get a chance this summer, this was, I always forget which is which. There's Bull Creek and Little Bull Creek that come together there in Negley. And Camp Frederick sits between the two. So at Camp Frederick, you can go over to one side and walk around in Bull Creek, and you go to the other side and you walk around in Little Bull Creek, and then they come to a point right outside of Negley, and that's where they come together. And we sampled in both streams. I can't remember which one we got the sculpin in, but they're in, those are both creeks that are wooded, cold, rocky, cobbly bottoms. They're in pretty good shape, and so they've got some neat organisms in them. Okay. We're going to do sort of a comparison here. They both have sort of alternate names, and their alternate names in both cases come from the letters of the alphabet that they look like. So exponential growth model gets called what kind of growth? J-curve. So this is also called J-curve growth. And logistic, we didn't mention it as strongly. It's not as obvious, but logistic gets called S-curve. And it's sort of a flattened out S, but it's an S nonetheless. S-curve growth. And both of these, remember, let's talk about what a model is. What's a model? Well, it can be a diagram. What else can it be? A graph. Bryce, you just pulled up a model. What kind of model was it? A map. A picture can be a model. A globe is a model of the Earth. We can have a mathematical model. So a model is a representation of reality. Represents something in the real world. So a model just represents something in the real world. It's not the real world. It's a way of describing how things work. Okay. If we compare a globe of the Earth to the Earth, are there some important differences? There's a lot more water on the Earth. Globes have no water. The Earth is a whole lot bigger. Globes are not volcanically active. It would be really cool, like in some sort of Harry Potter world, you could have an actual miniaturized model of the Earth, and it would have little volcanoes and oceans and rivers and weather and storms. I've got this whole image going. It can't exist in our world, but models always make some kind of assumption. For a model to work, we always say, well, if the following is true, then, so each of these models has their own assumptions. So in the exponential growth model, do you remember what the assumption was? And you can flip back in your notes if you need to. Exponential growth model assumes that something doesn't change birth and death rate, no matter how big the population gets. That should be don't, I guess, since it's plural. So the exponential growth model assumes that birth and death rates don't change no matter how big the population it gets. That whether you have 50 bass in that pond or 1,000 bass in that pond, nothing's changing. The logistic growth model has some other assumptions. So it assumes that there is a carrying capacity. Which is, it assumes that there is some absolute upper number of individuals the environment can support. That if you have a pond the size of ours, you can't support 1 million smallmouth bass. It also assumes, though, that the carrying capacity doesn't change. Okay? It assumes that carrying capacity doesn't change as the population gets bigger. And of course, we know things can happen in the environment which do change the carrying capacity. Things do happen to change carrying capacity. But S-curve assumes that birth and death rates do change. I'm going to have to shrink this, I'm afraid. So really, exponential only has that one assumption. No matter how big the population gets, birth and death rate are going to be the same. Logistic assumes that there is some point at which the birth and death rate will change, that there's a carrying capacity, but the carrying capacity doesn't change. Okay. I'm already seeing an essay question on your test for this unit of comparing the assumptions of the exponential and logistic growth model. I'm also seeing some good using graphics kind of questions, like, you know, given this, find the carrying capacity. Given this graph, does this represent, does this demonstrate exponential growth or logistic growth? Those are all good kinds of questions for this. Tomorrow there will be a brief recall quiz comparing the two models, and that's where we'll stop for today.